Jim Joyce, another
We're on a
week.
we're on a roll, baby. We're on a roll. We're on a roll.
I know
Welcome.
your
Happy Wednesday.
background is different. Where are you at?
I'm
Well,
in
I know where you at, but
yeah,
tell
yeah.
our listeners.
I'm in beautiful sunny Lisbon, along with 70,000 new friends. That was as we descended on the city. Technology companies from all over the world at the Web Summit. So I think
Amazing.
it has to be one of the biggest conferences in Europe. I'd say, if not the biggest. I'd say, Irish founded, Portuguese
That's
related,
right. That's
Portuguese
right.
related.
Honestly, never made it. And again, I haven't had any FOMO towards conferences at all, but it looks amazing. Should actually, I saw a bunch of other people. I don't know, how long are you staying there? I'll maybe WhatsApp a bunch of people your way.
Yeah.
Though you have 70,000 that you're navigating anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like, it's like one of these big conferences like, like Health or JP Morgan or, you know, um, uh,
yeah,
CMS, whatever it's called,
but
but like him, something where you're just meeting so many people over and over again.
yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's
Well,
it's great.
listen,
It's
yeah, I was
work.
gonna say you're representing Clear IP strong,
Yeah.
so awesome.
Yep. Yeah, Clear IP's there. We're bringing on our first clients, lots of demand for it. So
Fantastic.
yeah, excited
Well,
about that.
before we let our guest in, because he's been patiently waiting, I also want to say today is World Kindness Day. I just found out. So just remember to be fucking kind. That's it.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
All
So
right, on that, let's get Brian in.
okay. So as
We've ha
Brian walks,
as Brian is getting in, I've been looking forward to it. I've heard quite a lot of good things about Cumulus and Brian, and I love having, I'll say, more scientific founders. I know we had Ross a couple of episodes ago. So Brian,
yeah,
welcome.
yeah. I'll tee you up, Brian.
Yeah.
So Brian and I share a phenomenal friend through the pharmaceutical industry and as a venture. I think Aiden King, right? And then Brian I would describe you as a worldly displaced Irishman scientist.
We're gonna have to
That's
double
fair.
click on
Yeah.
that. We're gonna have to double
Let's
click
double
on
click
that.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of sitting down with him, and afterwards I said, "Oh, we got to bring this guy on." He's like, there's so much going on with him, his journey, his career, and what he's doing now in health tech. So it was a coffee shop on Dame Street in Dublin that Brian was looking to kind of reconnect with people in Ireland. I had the pleasure of chatting with him. So Brian, I don't know if Eugene, you want to tee him up. What we usually do
I
is
was gonna say for the millions of listeners and viewers, please take us through your life journey. As I always say, you can start
Okay.
from birth, you can pick up from now, wherever you want to go.
Okay. Great. Okay. Very nice to meet you, Eugene. First time I'm meeting you for the first time. So it's a pleasure.
Same.
So yeah, I'm sitting in Dublin today and I'm from here. I guess I describe myself as so kind of professionally when I'm talking to other scientists, and most of our customers are scientists. I call myself a computational cognitive neuroscientist. But I suppose I'm also kind of an engineer. I'm also an entrepreneur, and or to put it another way, I'm a very impatient scientist, right? So I'm a scientist who wants to see things happen, see things, try and make a bit of a difference, because they're big problems we're trying to tackle. Um, Companies, Cumulus Neuroscience, and I think if I think about the company, so I'm a co-founder of the company, chief scientific officer. It's kind of a sum of all the things I've done in my life in many ways. Of course, my other co-founders and all the great team we have. But kind of going back, yes, I'm from Dublin. Grew up here, kind of south of Dublin, kind of leafy suburb by the sea, and think I'll be listening to your other podcast, which would be brilliant as well, hearing all these stories and people's motivations, which is intriguing. What
yeah,
drives people to do this stuff, which is hard. This is not an easy business to be working in.
Yeah.
It's challenging. And I suppose from my point of view, one thing is I've always been fascinated by computation. And so my father was a very accomplished academic. So he did he came from a farming family in Ireland and ended up getting a master's in Cornell, then another master's in Harvard, and then a PhD in Princeton. And what he was doing in the
Wow.
60s was basically computational architecture. So can you make, it's a very 1960s idea, kind of Le Corbusier sort of idea, which is, can you make societies better by having optimal buildings that create better communities? And then he said, well, let's try and answer that question with a computer. So let's try and do simulations of, can I build or design a space with, exits and entrances here or there. I think he chose a courtyard in his student residence in Princeton. And if I place them here or there, let's run simulations and say, where do I put them that people bump into each other more often, right? But this is in the days when a computer fills a room, right? And you have to
Yep.
kind of
Mainframes.
stay up late. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And we still find, when as a kid, we found in the attic like these old punch cards, the punch cards that you had to punch and then feed into the machine to program, and then the old
Yeah.
matrix
But
printer output and everything.
Brian, did you say he came from a farming family?
He did, yeah. He came from a farming family originally. Yeah, he did. His
This
dad
is
was like,
typical. This is typical of a farming family. That's
well, I don't know actually. Yeah, no, his dad was like a kind of a merchant, in agricultural merchant, and it
right.
was very funny because like my dad did this. He ended up being a professor here in Ireland, and his father was still kind of, God, when's Brendan going to get a real job? You know what I mean? He's just going around doing
Yeah.
teaching. So he's an inspiration, and also the fact that he kind of started off in engineering, slowly moved through that in kind of urban design into architecture, had this kind of multidisciplinary trajectory. As did in fact my mum as well. So she was a kind of an academic librarian who then became an architect later. She was kind of pregnant with me when she'd become an architect, like studied retraining as an architect. Um, and another thing then they kind of, so that computation thing came from him, and then also a wonderful thing we had as children, I guess, as maybe unusually in Ireland at that time, is that we used to go on these long kind of driving holidays around Europe every couple of years. The parents would save up and they'd set off around Europe, and they would stay with all their friends who had been postdocs and PhDs back in his graduate student days. So we stayed in like Lisbon and Madrid and southern Germany and Italy and
Wow.
everything. So always had an interest in travel and languages. And but then another kind of defining sort of less I suppose less happy point in the life was I lost my father quite young. He died in his early 50s, and he died because of from a preventable cause, because of a misdiagnosis or a partial diagnosis, right?
Yep.
And kind of, again, you see that obviously for us personally it was an enormous tragedy, but that sort of thing happens a lot. You know what I mean? It happens quite often, and not because people don't care or aren't trying, because people don't have the resources or the tools that allow them to diagnose properly, and then they may not have the right. We know in brain health where we work, they may also may not have the right treatments. So that's kind of background and motivation, and then so history. I kind of got out of school as quick as I could. Went straight off to Spain, where I'd spent time as a teenager because I got family there as well. Did a year as an English teacher in Spain, came back, did 3 years in Belfast studying engineering. Took a year out during that in Germany, so in Munich, Technical University of Munich. So then I knew in German at that stage. Went back to Munich after my degree. And really luckily I was looking for a job in aircraft engineering. It's a very cyclical industry.
Wow.
When I came out, it's kind of a low point. And I was trying to get a job. Munich's a good place for that. Couldn't get a job, but fell into working in an internet company because I could already code. I taught myself to code already. So started working with them. It was a really, really great company. It was kind of a leading company at the time, and I'd say at least in Germany, maybe in Europe, for web production. We did like all the Daimler-Benz, Mercedes, DASA, all that stuff, like Deutsche Telekom stuff. And so learned how to make really nice web presences early on. That was like 95, I guess. And then Sonic got a bit bored of that and went to China. So I went to Beijing. And my initial brief in going to Beijing was to put an existing kind of events magazine, kind of an expat events magazine on the web. So I went to China and made China's first English language online magazine in 97. And then we got shut down 3 months later.
And did you go with the
Go ahead.
firm that you were with, or
No,
was
I
kind
just
of
no,
like a okay?
I went across. I found I
Okay.
found the job over the internet, which was fascinating. Like in 1996, 97, getting a job over the internet was probably a relatively new thing at that time.
I think you're
And
like
so
I'm feeling like I'm feeling like an intellectual Forrest Gump here. Picking up-
well,
Think
yeah,
like you're
it
picking
was
up languages. Yeah, like, if I just catch the last like 4 minutes, you've acquired computer programming, website building, Cantonese, Chinese,
yeah,
Spanish.
exactly.
Yeah, I
Well,
was
I'll
gonna
tell you.
say a global citizen computing your way through.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. I think
Right.
actually, if I look back, that kind of trajectory of learning kind of flattened out when I had children. It's kind of all of a sudden you're
Right.
like, no, I've no time left to learn anything anymore. But in those earlier days when you're younger. Um,
Right.
so, uh, so we went over, we got closed down then a few months later for being China's first English language magazine and online magazine. And then I ended up kind of freelancing and went into eventually into Reuters. So that was really interesting. Reuters is, a fintech
Yep.
company, really interesting company kind of working with the stock exchanges there, People's Bank of China, trying to get real-time prices into over internet technologies into trading rooms and into broader parts of those organizations. That was an exciting thing to be doing like 98. And then that turned into a spin out. So we did a spin out. So I was kind of co-founder of a fintech spin out then, kind of 99 to 2000 at Beijing. And that was wonderful. Loved Beijing, incredible experience, amazing country. Did a lot of travel, biked over the Himalayas. Was kind of the most extravagant thing I did, and learned the language. Really, really fabulous place. And then decided, okay, I wanted to do. I loved that, but I felt like I needed to do something that would make more of a difference. So, kind of while it was fabulous people, great team, interesting product, ultimately I didn't care enough about selling prices, spending market prices. Whether it was us or Bloomberg selling, that wouldn't really get me up in the morning, 5 days a week for the next 10 years, you know what I mean? Or 7 days a week for the next 10 years. So I thought, okay, I'll come back to Ireland and retrained as a scientist, as a kind of cognitive scientist, first of language, computational linguistics, machine learning was kind of the topic of my PhD. And that was brilliant here in Dublin. From there, then I jumped to Italy and I'm just looking at the clock. I don't want to use like the whole hour up, just kind of giving you kind of like a me jumping around the world.
Just key
Um,
milestones around the world. Exactly.
yeah, we're getting there. It'll all make sense in a minute. Yeah, so
Got
went
time.
to Italy, and there was a great in the Italian Alps, University of Trento, at the Tango Rovereto. There was a brilliant institute set up by a Harvard professor, a guy called Alfonso Caramazza, an Italian who'd gone back, and he had got this brilliant group of international researchers, a lot of them Italians who had worked around the world or other folks, and got the really good scanning resources. So we had fMRI and MEG and EEG. So, three important brain scanning modalities or technologies that allow you to understand the fine time kind of the tiny time frames of brain activity, which is very fast, or the very with EEG, or the very fine resolution of parts of the brain with fMRI. You can ask very different questions with those different tools. So we started kind of trying to tie these models or make models of brain activity, tie them together with language models. So we were building kind of large language models, what we thought were large language models in those
Hmm.
days, right? Much smaller in those days. But I
Everything
worked
is
with
relative.
Right.
everything is relative, yeah, and you could see. I mean, there were big advances being made there. I mean, maybe we could talk about kind of AI in general later. That would be interesting. But um, in those days, we were trying to learn, uh, learn the meaning of words and concepts from the way they appear in different texts. It's the basic distributional hypothesis at the basis of all large language models. Um, but also do it in a way where you have models that have some sort of cognitive plausibility and interpretability. So I was working with Massimo Boesio there and also Marco Baroni. He's now with Facebook. He's one of the guys who first started building these large multilingual collections of language to build big multilingual large language models. So doing
Interesting.
that,
No, but not that much people talk about Llama, right? The Facebook's LLM. I mean, I don't want to dive into it, but
yeah,
just
I'm
fascinating to me.
yeah, I'm not, and I'm actually not. I should be clear. I'm not that up on all of those things now either. Now because I'm now totally focused on brains. Um,
Mm.
but we were there trying to start to tie up these models of cognition as expressed, kind of empirically based or grounded models of cognition as learned from a language database to patterns of brain activity. So I did that for a few years, and then was really lucky to get like a position in with Tom Mitchell in Carnegie Mellon, Department of Machine Learning. So this is like 2011, I think, and at that time it was the only Department of Machine Learning in the world. So like an absolute, the best place in the world that it could be, because he was a pioneer. He's still working on this stuff. Pioneer in reading cognitive states from brain activity, but also a pioneer in learning language from the internet. So he had this, you may have heard of the never-ending language learner. It's a NEL, which
Hmm.
just kind of crawled around the internet, picking up facts and learning that, the learning explicitly in a way that's interpretable to us and is encoded clearly that the capital of France is Paris, for instance, or, uh, you know, uh, let's see, husbands are male and wives are female. All of this real world knowledge that they were learning. So that was a great place to be, where we could marry those things on a larger scale. And kind of from that time, the paper I'm most proud of is one. It was led by Leila Wavy. She's now a professor there in Carnegie Mellon. She was a PhD student at the time. And what we did there is we got people to sit in an fMRI scanner and read a chapter of Harry Potter one word by word, one word by one on the screen. And you would then build a model of what reading each sentence, or reading each word, or reading each paragraph entailed in terms of psychological operations. So obviously you need to, understand the letters and the word and retrieve the word and know what it means, and then refer that to the character. It refers to integrated sentence structures, all of that. And there's multiple levels of representation and implied processing in just reading a simple sentence, right? So we built those models, and then we're able to reverse engineer a mapping to the brain activity such that we could brain read out and guess you just read this sentence of that sentence based on your fMRI activity, right? And this was 2012ish, 2013, something like
You
that.
could figure out what I just read by my brain activity, what word.
Exactly. Yeah. And up approximately, it wasn't perfect, but like way better than chance.
Something is better than nothing.
Something is better than nothing. Yeah, no, it was a proof of concept, and it was doing this sort of thing for a long time. Like Tom had a paper in 2005 in Science showing that he could read out the meaning of single words from brain activity. And then Jim Haxby, who actually worked with him back in Italy as well, from Dartmouth, had shown in 2001 he could brain read out, are you thinking about like a living thing or a non-living thing? Those patterns of brain activity be visible for a long time in fMRI recordings, but people were learning that there was a really fine grain in each little pixel or voxel of it that might collectively hold a lot more meaning. And
And sorry, can I? Yeah, go ahead,
I
Jim.
was just, could Eugene and I put these on, like have our brain activity, and then we could read we could just have a conversation without speaking.
Certainly the technology we had then, no. And it was also an fMRI scanner. So you'd both be
I'm not,
lying in.
I'm not
Have you ever
sure if
been
I
to an
want
fMRI
that, by
scanner?
the way.
Yeah,
Jim,
exactly.
just no
We're
offense to you, man.
160. We're 100.
Yeah.
How many episodes are we now, Eugene? We're 158, 159.
Yeah, something like that. Only one. This is 153, but
153. I'm jumping ahead.
yeah.
And this was the foundation. This work is the foundation for Cumulus.
In a way, yeah. So it's a foundation for kind of the original vision I had, which is that, well, I'll tell you the experience. So that was great. That was fun. That was cool. We got your press releases about it. It's kind of a very kind of media friendly piece of science. Um, but then my colleagues from machine learning would come to me and say, wow, tell me about your data set. There must be so much stuff in there. I want to learn how the brain works from your data set. And I said, well, the embarrassing fact is we had 45 minutes each by 8 individuals. And all of those individuals happen to be PhD students or postdocs, right? And you're kind of saying, how can we seriously make any claims about how human cognition works based on these tiny samples?
Right.
And we're not unusual either. If you look across psychology and cognitive neuroscience, there's loads of papers published with maybe more than 8, but 30 is a big number in that world.
Right.
And kind of that general objection, which is that a challenge is that, how representative is lying in an fMRI scanner of my day-to-day life? Not very. How representative are these 8 people of humanity in general? Not especially. We don't really know. So that's where I thought what we really need is we need a way to be able to objectively measure the brain at scale while the brain is doing something we know about, something we can measure.
Okay.
That was kind of something I hit about 2012, 2013, kind of had that realization that that's what I need to do, right? And I think that is, and again, looking at exactly what has happened in language technologies, one of the biggest drivers, not the only driver, but probably the biggest driver has been just enormous quantities of well-labeled data or sort of interpretable data, let's put it that way. And that's what we're lacking in when we're trying to understand the brain, or I guess, human health in general.
Okay. And then, okay, so then just to kind of bring us in now into Cumulus, so then you went and set up Cumulus, right?
Yeah, that's right.
To do what, like in a simple sentence, like what is Cumulus? What does
What
it
was the
do?
Right.
hypothesis for it?
Yeah, exactly. So Cumulus now, I mean, we've been around for a few years. So Cumulus now, uh, our aim is to objectively measure brain health and mental health in a way that can be useful to doctors and to people who are developing new therapies.
Okay.
And sorry, in the real world, I should say. Sorry. Yeah.
So like clinical trials.
Yeah, exactly. So we do both. So we do, we're now working on the product kind of in R&D. The product we're most excited about will go into US healthcare in for screening and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. But then the business, our kind of commercial business today is almost exclusively working for pharma companies or medical device companies who are trying to have better tools to understand first who they should have in their clinical trials. Do they have the right variety of patient in their clinical trial? Or once somebody's in the clinical trial, is that what negative or positive effects does that therapy have on the patients?
And have you thought about putting them on political candidates?
Yeah, I mean, there is
Wait,
actually a lot of work on that.
I
I
promise
don't
I
do
won't
that, but
say that.
well, I was gonna say it's no longer candidates, right? But I guess it depends on which country and where, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on, but
We won't go there.
yeah,
We won't go there. What
and
do you want?
and 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 the question becomes again, maybe just I'm curious because you said kind of measure mental health, right? Because I just my sidekick ChatGPT, I just kind of asked how much of a brain do we understand as scientists, and first it
mm,
started giving me blah blah blah. It's impossible to quantify, and I said, well, just give me a percentage, and it said 20 to 30%. And so the question becomes how you measuring it, and we don't need to get into the truly like, is it passive? I mean, we all know, GAT7, PHQ 8 or 9, other things that are patient reported, which is already then skewed to a certain extent, right? Because I, as an individual, report it. And so anyway, I'll pause, but like I'm just curious on the product that you're excited about, right? Probably less, yeah.
yeah. So there are different things you can do, and we're very lucky in about halfway through Cumulus's life. We got together with the Dementia Discovery Fund. They're a VC. They're part of SV Health Investors, a VC based in London, and LifeArc. And they had already got together a group of their LPs, a group of pharma companies, who said, we are investing with you in all these new therapies. They were first thinking in dementia and Alzheimer's disease primarily, but we don't have the tools to measure whether they work. And we need to do something about that together, right? So they sat down with a blank piece of paper and said, okay, if you want to solve this problem, what do you need? You need to have objective measurement. You need to have frequent measurement. You need to be able to measure outside of clinics. And you need to be able to measure across multiple domains. You want to measure memory, executive function, that's kind of a fancy word for decision making or attention, mood, language, sleep, neurophysiology. They wanted to have a package of all of these things, and that should be in a package which is easy for patients to use and not intimidating or kind of not accessible to them. Um, and so we do all of those things, and some of those technologies are things we've developed in-house from scratch. We've developed our wireless dry EEG. Dry EEG means you don't have gel to put on the sensors. You can put it on and off quickly. And we've developed that and brought it to 510K clearance ourselves, all developed internally with our engineering team.
You've
But we've
you've
also,
developed the device that goes that attaches in. You've developed that.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. We developed that from scratch, yeah, and qualified it. And then we also have some technologies we bring in from other people. So to your question about uh, mental health, we do spend a lot of time looking at mechanisms. Maybe I can talk about that in a minute. But if you're talking about how you're feeling, I think mental health and psychiatric disease, okay, maybe schizophrenia is different, but say anxiety or depression, the most
Hmm.
common ones, are mostly about how you feel. And ultimately, it's how you feel is what you're trying to change, right? So you can never completely get away from subjectivity in that case. But so we do use questionnaires too. But one of the technologies we use, which is not based on subjective self-reports or kind of the bias,
Hmm.
memory bias, telling people what they want to hear or not remembering how you're feeling um, or how you were feeling last week, excuse me. So what we work with a partner called Pivotal. They were a long time ago. They're a well-established company, but they're originally an Oxford spin-out, and they present a whole load of faces to people. And these are faces where actors have acted, I'm happy or sad or surprised or whatever. But then they've computationally morphed these faces from 100% happy to 80% happy, 50% happy, 10% happy. And different people have different sensitivities, but everyone's got a certain point at which you can't really tell anymore. Maybe for you it's 10%, for me it's 20%, whatever. If you present a load of these marginally happy, surprised, whatever faces to people where they don't really know, if you are depressed, you're going to start seeing sadness where there is no sadness. So there's indeterminate ones you're going to label as sad. If you're anxious, you're going to say fear for those indeterminate ones. So that is actually an objective measure of mood, which we use. Um, but then in other parts of mental health, you can be looking at things like neuroplasticity. So, the ability, like often in particularly depression, people have got stuck in certain ways of thinking, certain habits of thinking.
Hmm.
Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches you to try and change your ways of thinking, kind of get out of the thinking rut. But it can also be, let's say, it can be that plus a biological driver. So you may have lower neuroplasticity than would be normal for somebody of your age. There are then some therapies that exist, some, for example, psychedelics, but also being developed, which will temporarily boost your neuroplasticity and allow you to kind of jump out of that rut, give you an opportunity for kind of therapeutic change. So we can also
Right.
look at mechanisms
And
underlying it.
Brian, what are your thoughts on vocal biomarkers? I mean, there's been efforts for probably the last decade around it just to pick up stressors. So I'm
Yeah,
curious if you guys are looking at that, or
yeah,
is that part of the equation?
yeah. There's some great companies working. We've actually been working with Winterlight Labs out of Toronto. So they're
Oh
our
yeah.
partner for voice markers. Liam and the guys, they're great scientists. Um, I think for me, they fall into, you can look at vocal biomarkers in two different ways. One is looking at them acoustically. So if you're trying to understand a disease like Parkinson's, for example, multiple sclerosis, Huntington's disease, ALS, with major motor impairments, you can detect simple things like people are just saying fewer words per
Hmm.
minute, or that their voice quality has changed because they don't have the same control of their vocal tract. So that's definitely a very strong thing. I think when you get to, then you can also go deeper. You can say, well, how rich is the vocabulary that people are using, or kind of how rich are the sentence structures they're using? Those are useful markers. But I think in the absence of a good history of the person, they're maybe not that
You don't
informative.
have a
Some people are
baseline.
just, yeah,
Right.
exactly, because you don't have a baseline. Yeah, exactly. And I think it falls into, and of course, you can also do it in a way where you have an assigned task, like describe this picture, tell me how you were this word today, read this paragraph, right? It's very controlled. Or you can do it completely passively, just in picking up what people are doing and as they use their phone. I think on that
Right.
passive side, there's all sorts of risks of false positives. Um, because it's not
No.
very controlled, which again we could talk. It's a general problem with passive data
And you
collection,
will
not just
like in this work you're doing in the Alzheimer's space. So will your measures be used as endpoints within the label of the pharmaceutical companies when it's done collaboratively, or is it just to support and try to identify when the drugs are working?
Yeah, we're usually at the moment we're more in the earlier stages. So kind of when you first bring a drug into humans or first into your healthy humans and then patients, is the
Yep.
drug engaging with the brain mechanisms in the same ways as you sometimes based on work they've done with, say, rodents. So
Okay.
EEG, electroencephalography, brainwave recordings, very important there. Um, and then also in those early stages of therapy development, they usually want to throw quite a wide evidentiary net. So they want to look at language and mood and memory and all of these things in one package. And that's why having it all in one one-stop shop is very important for it actually getting used.
Okay.
Um, but absolutely, a lot of the reason people are talking to us is because they say this setup, is designed to be home usable. Our very first field trials in 2017 were in the home with older people working totally on their own. If it's easy enough for them to use at home, that means it would also be easy enough to deploy to clinics and could be a companion biomarker. So it could be a companion diagnostic in the future. for example, to help you decide should they take this drug or a different drug, or if they take this drug, how often should they take it? When do they need to be redosed? And so on. Yeah.
Right. And what it like because but it won't not it's not yet going to be, oh, it's a clinic, it's in the SBC in the product insert sheet that said per the Cumulus biomarker we achieved, better states of mental health or
It,
cognitive.
it may be, yeah. So there's two things. So there's one is that the FDA is understandably cautious in
Yeah.
accepting totally new sorts of evidence when they're deciding whether a drug is safe and effective. And they're also very costly, right? So these are difficult decisions to make. And we have seen there's been a real breakthrough there last year. There was a small company called Valeraphon, a biotech. I don't know if you've heard of them. They were working on a respiratory disease. And they actually, it was a niche disease where there weren't already well-established clinical trial endpoints. There wasn't like an existing endpoint to displace. And they actually, that one company working with Actigraph, they're like a kind of a scientific grade actigraphy company out of the US, worked with them to develop a biomarker and get it qualified for their phase 3 all-in-one drug program with the FDA, which is the first time that's ever happened. That's really impressive. So I think we're going to get there. I think we may get there sooner with the smaller diseases, which are underserved.
Okay.
Like ALS, Huntington's, for example, we've got examples of borderline personality disorder. These ones that are just not as well studied, and
Yeah.
there isn't much evidence about how to measure it. Yeah.
Are you ever like, sorry, Eugene, go ahead.
No. You were following the train. I was gonna go somewhere else with it, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going a little too. So, are you ever fascinated? I'm just sitting listening, and thinking about it. Like, and I'm at the Web Summit right now, and I'm watching these speakers, sit on stage to these like incredibly distracted audiences, right? So big audiences, but unless you're on the center stage where you're sitting in the chair and the music is all focusing you in, everyone's kind of all over the place because there's just so much going on. It's a fantastic conference, but you're so stimulated in all different directions, and there's no way. Like, so when someone going in these big, heavy subjects that they're talking about, how many people in that audience? So have you ever thought about, just maybe going left on this a little bit, like just areas of like learning, like, if you're a teacher sitting in front of a class, and especially as someone who learned, you obviously have a high capacity for learning to code and language, but in each of your language abilities, you were in immersive experiences of being in
Yeah.
those countries, right?
Yeah.
So like you'd imagine that you could start to use this technology to say, okay, Jim is in a learning mode right now, or the students are, or they're not, because it
Yeah.
must be so much time wasted on bullshit lectures where no one's learning anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or or some
Absolutely.
trigger to snap you into the learning mode somehow.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Have you just played around with it to try to figure some of this stuff out? You must, or
We Yeah, so I mean, these are the things that if I was still an academic, I'd probably be doing that as well, right? So we did.
right,
I have talked to at various times to one of the really big Chinese educational companies about doing exactly that to
okay,
understand um, when certain students are too challenged or not challenged enough, and then to pitch correctly to them, and also to entertainment companies about uh, understanding group experiences of, say, a film or something like a movie, right? Because in a way, if a movie is a successful movie, if a director is a good director, they're managing to drive everyone in the audience along the same sort of emotional path and
yeah,
experience, right?
yeah,
And then
that's
they'll be
cool.
synchronized. So you look at this idea of synchrony, and certainly a headset like ours, which is easy to use, relatively cheap to produce. You
Right,
have loads of them in a room at the same time, could be used to answer those sorts of questions. But
yeah, or like
we're focused on
concerts.
health today. But yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to if I had unlimited
Well,
time or could clone
but now
myself.
all
Yeah.
that stuff's going to start merging. Like I was just talking with a company the other day, a music is medicine is company, and and they're, people going from these Alzheimer's dementia states, with instructive song into speaking again, into attending their kid's wedding, and
Hmm.
recognizing their children for the first time. So it's not far, right? Like you could be there.
No, not at all. Yeah, not at all.
Cool, cool,
Yeah, we're
cool.
focused on measurement today for the
Yeah,
moment. But yeah,
yeah. You got to get the job done. Yeah, Eugene,
yeah.
what do you got, Eugene?
I lost my train of thought from before. So, but
The,
okay, hold on. It just brought me back.
the
Yeah,
headset.
tell me.
So, and I was doing some digging on what Brian said earlier on ChatGPT. So, thank you for bringing me back. But where I was going to go is originally. So, given what you're trying to measure And given the fact that you're today kind of part of the clinical trials, so would you broadly say you're a digital biomarkers company? I mean, you have two sides to the business, right? On one side, you're either developing or pulling together digital biomarkers. On the other side, you have a kind of a services business to a certain extent, and you're productizing, right?
Yeah.
So, and kind of your thoughts on digital biomarkers, because obviously there's certain biomarkers that need to go through an FDA approval for them to be counted, or validated. Um, how do you look at that? And as you guys are growing the business, because it's a tough market, right? It's a very tough market from a digital biomarker perspective.
It is, yeah. Well, I suppose to speak about digital biomarkers in general first, I mean, sometimes I get the sense that certain scientists, when they say digital biomarkers, they mean not very good biomarkers, right? It's kind of code for, and,
Code.
and sometimes I see where they're coming from. Like there was one of the best bits of work I've seen. I was at AAAI in Vancouver there earlier this year, was a group from Singapore who were doing real work in Singapore. They were working for, I think, the Ministry of Health there. And they had a system where they could monitor people's phones and look at your sleep patterns and vocal biomarkers, the amount of movement, GPS, all of this stuff that we're all familiar with, and then see are there anomalies. And these are people they know it to be at risk of psychiatric disease. And then if they saw something change, they thought, okay, what's the reason for this sudden change? And they would ring them up. And often it would be the person got a new job, or they've got a new girlfriend or boyfriend, or similar, or they moved house, or let's say they had COVID, or they're sick for a while, or occasionally it was because they were suicidal, right? And then these people were saved. So it was saving lives, but with a huge number of false positives, because we don't really know what those things mean. I think someday we may, when we hit a tipping point of these enormous data sets. But my feeling is that tipping point is still very, very, very far away, just in a pure data quantity point of view, but also the fact that, understandably, when it comes to people's personal health data, we're very careful about how we collect and process that data. We have the controls in place as we should.
Yeah.
Your comment earlier cracked me up on digital biomarkers and the quality, because one of the things that I read, and I actually use this all the time on back in when it was still called Twitter, ages ago, was that if you torture data long enough, it can confess to anything, right? And
Exactly.
and that's
Yeah.
a little bit of like, okay, well, what outcome are we looking for, and how do we slice and dice, and how do we look at it, and what's the cohort, and well, all of a sudden, right?
Right.
So anyway,
You find a pattern. Exactly. Which is,
um,
the danger of epidemiological studies, or if, there's a 2005 paper by John Ioannucci who says, most published research findings are false,
no.
which was true, what I mean, because of these problems.
I have another one, and don't want to get philosophical in this, but when I entered big pharma, and as this kind of entrepreneurial digital guy that let's move fast, right? And experiment, nobody could understand what does that mean, experiment, right? Which was dumbfounding to me, because science is based on, quickly proving or disproving hypotheses. And so my comment was always, you have a huge R&D department that all they do all day is, prove and disprove hypotheses, right? And, kind of keep moving
Yep.
as quickly as you can. So
Yep.
the big question that I have for you is, as a scientist, but also as an entrepreneur, how do you look at this dichotomy, right? And especially that
Yeah.
you said you're a very impatient scientist. So,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, so so maybe I'll go back and continue the answer to the previous question to lead into this, is that, so the digital biomarkers we have, are the markers. I just call them markers, so it's not to be controversial, because we're not measuring proteins in fluid, for example, are happen to be digitally collected, but that's
mhm.
almost kind of incidental. Who cares? I mean, so what?
Hmm.
Point is, we want to measure things that have clinical utility and interpretation. So we're quite conservative in the things we try to measure. What we do is we take, for example, a task. There's a task called the flanker task. People have been doing it since at least the 60s, probably longer. Recording EEG with it, which is a task to learn about inhibition, executive control. It's a cognitive test.
Yep.
And you can also elicit EEG patterns that tell you about how aware you are of mistakes you're making. So it's really neat. You can run this task. It's like a gray screen, little arrows and things on it. You look at a fixation graph, press a button, follow some instructions, record the EEG. You get a few different endpoints out of it, as a farm would call it, endpoints. But it's incredibly boring. And you can do it once in a lab while somebody stands kind of behind you and looks over your shoulder in a white coat. But if you said, bring this home, if we try this, bring this home and do it 5 days a week for 3 weeks, sooner or later, you stop
Never
doing
gonna
it.
happen. Yeah.
But before you stop doing it, you stop caring about it. And that whatever data you submit will not have any validity. You're not actually trying, right? Or you're trying as hard as you can, but your brain is just not really engaging. So an important point for us was to take existing technologies, existing like EEG, but also cognitive tests, and make them more engaging and usable. So we use a bit of gamification in our tasks. We've got a headset together with a tablet. The tablet tasks are, I suppose, slightly gamified, because there's a danger of gamifying, that you would kind of gamify too much and invalidate the science. But we ground all of our tests in things for which there's decades and decades of literature. So we can go up to the pharma companies and say, although this is more convenient and more scalable, it is also, you can draw a direct line back to this thing that everyone in science agrees and means X or means Y. And that's made our job, that's made our job harder up front, because there are more design constraints and you have to do an awful lot of validation to prove that what you're measuring out in somebody's home is exactly the same thing you do at home. But once you do that, then it gets a lot easier. And then we're talking to the pharma companies and we're talking to scientists mostly, and we're saying, these are all these aspects of, of low mood, or reducing neuroplasticity, or working memory impairments, or whatever that you'd like to measure. These papers, we can do that in the home. Here's a short paper to demonstrate that's true, that we're doing it successfully. And then they can go to their colleagues in clinical trials operations, who are often more cautious, as is their function, not to let anything mess up the clinical trial, and say, well, this is easy to use. You can do it in the home, so it won't mess with the protocol or use up time or complexity for the clinical teams. And it's also an exploratory or a secondary biomarker. So we keep the traditional ones, but we've got additional ones for additional information. And that works quite well in phase 1 and phase 2. It's not phase 3, where it's, a registered endpoint that the FDA will rely precisely and only on this to say the drug is approved. But it's a sort of information that allows the drug company to make a decision to move forward with something or not. Say they have a phase 2 study, usually they're a little bit underpowered and have as many people in as they'd like to. The main endpoint, they may kind of get an ambiguous answer. It's kind of on the borderline. Is it working or not working? Hard to say. If they've got 2 or 3 other tests which measure something similar,
Brian,
and all say that it's working, versus all say that it's not working, those are 2 different situations.
Just like Jim brought me back earlier, I'm going to bring you back to the question of how you think about hypotheses and entrepreneurial.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the thing is, so the way it works for us is we will only move as quickly as the pharma companies will move. We know those customers well. We understand the science and the technology well. So we can we can come to them with a proposition which is value for them today. And the reason that works for us as a business long term is because all of those interactions with the pharma companies, it's like an incubator for biomarkers for clinical use. Right.
Got it.
These are like the toughest scientists in the world to satisfy.
You're in this. It seems like you're in this kind of this kind of collaborative state of, like Eugene when he walked into Bayer and he was saying, "Hey guys, you do experiments all the time, and you're like, you want the ones that need to fail in order to figure out what to do next, right? And so you're kind of in a state of you're doing that in partnership with them, right? So you're just kind of collaborating. You're not necessarily dictating the, hey, we're going to go at entrepreneurial pace on these tests, and you're in technology. Yeah.
No, cool. Absolutely not. And we're scientists, so we know that our stuff has to do what it's meant to do. It takes time to validate. And we've had the pharma companies involved with us for years, telling us how to do it in a way that they'll be satisfied with. We're very lucky to have them early on. We had the customers up front telling us what the product should look like, and that's now turned into what's going to be our first healthcare product, which is a non-invasive kind of non-challenging or non-anxiety inducing memory test for Alzheimer's, which is a big deal because people walk in into memory tests and they say, okay, remember this set of words or something. And, they could be an immigrant for whom the language isn't for first language. They
Yeah.
could be
Terrifying.
somebody for whom some of those words are really familiar or unfamiliar. They could be
Right.
more or less educated. They could have slept badly the night
It,
before.
it could
They
be
could
my
just be
my
absolutely terrified.
Right.
my ladies here call me fish brain. I just, there's certain things that go in and out, certain things remain, so it's the important factor applied. But listen, each one of those points I would have loved to double click on for many, many hours, but we are limited on time. So I think with this, I'm going to pass it back to Mr. Jim Joyce for his final famous question. And I
Right. So
love
you,
hearing these stories.
So we're going to go to the future in order to go in the past here. So we're well into the future, and you get an email. In fact, you don't even get an email; you just get a neuro signal coming through
Yeah.
and it's in multiple languages, and it's inviting you to keynote at a joint conference hosted by Carnegie Mellon and Queens College, and you're asked to give a keynote, and it's called Standard of Care, and they are celebrating the non-invasive neuro tracking tests that Cumulus has put in through there, and they're asked to describe how you did it. So you're up giving this great talk, but you're not just giving the talk in English; you're giving it in different languages, and you're bringing it all together. And the crowd is enamored, and they're enamored because they're all wearing tests. They all have little neuro tests on their heads, and as you're giving them, so you can see they're completely engaged with your topic. But there's one guy sitting there, and at the end of it, he rips off his test and he comes running towards you, and he said, Brian, you understand? I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you right now. You're Brian Murphy. I studied engineering and programming. My father was a farmer academic. I traveled the world and learned all these different languages. And I'm just about to start my first backed digital biomarker company. And when you look at that younger version of yourself, what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
Yeah, well, I think the one piece of advice I would give them, and I think that might relate to earlier than that as well, is uh, work in groups. One thing in academia, it encourages you to do stuff on your own, and that's a huge privilege, something I loved doing. But certainly I've been a much more happy and productive and the kind of world helping human being, I think, making more of a difference, working surrounded by other folks, finding other folks who share a desire to do things differently, to make it easier to detect and understand and treat diseases like dementia, diseases like depression, and that having those variety of points of view and variety of expertise, variety of personalities, um, it's so much more fun, and you get so much more done in kind of a lively group of people than you ever can on your own.
Amazing. It's like that line, if you want to go far, go together, right? So thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Love it. Yeah, love it. Love it. That's great,
Great.
Brian.
All right.
Appreciate your time. And for our listeners and viewers, hit subscribe, pass it on, and we'll see you next week.